Thank you for joining Brown's Center for Study of Slavery and Justice's graduate colloquium titled Humanities at the Limit of the Human. Earlier today, we began the workshop with some wonderful discussions, workshopping some of the participants' work. Now we are excited to transition to a public discussion with Professor Weheliye. This session will be introduced by Zuri, and then Zuri and I will ask a few pre-prepared questions. To conclude, we'll open the floor for questions. Workshop participants will be allowed to ask their questions directly to Professor Weheliye. We ask that you use the raise hand function so that we know you're interested in asking a question and can manage the queue. People in the audience will also be able to ask questions using the Q&A feature. Both the audience and workshop participants will be able to use the chat, but please don't put your questions in the chat because we may miss it. Now that those logistics are out of the way, I hand it over to Zuri.
Thanks, Damali. So I'll be introducing Dr. Weheliye. Alexander Weheliye is a professor of African American Studies at Northwestern University, where he teaches Black literature and culture, critical theory, social technologies, and popular culture. He's the author of Phonographies, Grooves in Sonic Afro-Modernity, which was awarded the Modern Language Association's William Sanders Scarborough Prize for Outstanding Scholarly Study of Black American Literature or Culture, and Habeas Viscus, Racializing Assemblages, Biopolitics, and Black Feminist Theories of the Human. Currently, he is working on two projects. The first, Phenon, R&B's Technologies of Humanity, offers a critical history of the intimate relationship between R&B music and technology since the late 1970s. The second, Black Life, Schwarzsein, situates Blackness as an ungendered ontology of unbelonging. His work has been published in many journals and the anthologies Black Europe and the African Diaspora, the Oxford Handbook of Mobile Music Studies, Why Rassismus? Sorry, my German is not where it should be, maybe. So I'm not going to stumble through, but there are multiple publications in German. So we're just going to get right into the questions. So our first question is, Dr. Weheliye, you're one of the foremost readers of Sylvia Wynter, who, as you know, highlights the importance of founding myths and origin stories. I believe this also happens on the personal scale as well. So can you tell us a little bit about your intellectual origin story and how that has come to define your work today? Where do you see the trajectory of your work going? And then finally, what advice do you have for younger scholars trying to find their footing within the academy who may be struggling to understand why they're doing what they're doing just yet?
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the questions. The origin story thing is a little bit tricky, but I'll try to attempt it because it's very trying to find the right word, seductive, right? In terms of trying to pinpoint particularly one particular event in this context. But I think overall, like a lot of my work, especially initially, was just trying to figure out my place in the world and making sense of who I was within the different contexts that I existed. So I had lived in East Germany, West Germany, Somalia, and the United States by the time that I was 13. And all of those different contexts sort of forced me to think about myself as a Black person, as a queer person, really differently. And I think that that's sort of what got me started initially in terms of thinking about some of the questions. And then when I initially encountered Black American writing and thought through Black German activism, that really, it seemed to be the closest to allowing me to find a language to deal with who I was within the different contexts that I was existing in, and I think also in a different way, the same thing with Black music, right? Particularly for me with R&B music, and existing in a context such as 1980s West Germany, where the term and the very idea that you could be Black and German did not even exist, right? So a lot of the kind of initial debates in terms of in terms of Black German activism were about finding a name and self-definition and reclamation, et cetera, and so on. And that's kind of the context when I first encountered Audre Lorde, for instance, and then later, you know, through high school and college, more Black thought, but particularly Black literature, Ralph Ellison, Richard Wright, and so on. And I think that that really is what kind of sort of pushed me in terms of thinking about it. And then I think, you know, just at a more material level, it also was really clear at a certain point that if this is something that I wanted to pursue, initially in terms of studying it, and secondly, in terms of a profession, that this is not something that I could do within the German context. And I think even though it's gotten a little bit easier, it's still very much the same situation in 2021 as it was in 1992 when I came to the United States to go to graduate school. And I don't know if I necessarily have a particular story about the trajectory of my work. I mean, I think it's just sort of that a set of questions and ideas has preoccupied me in different kinds of ways throughout, you know, my studies and later work. So yeah, and in terms of advice, I would say to you know, pursue the work that you think and feel that not only that you want to do, but that you think that needs to be done, while at the same time also remaining open to new ideas, different ideas, et cetera, and so on. That is what I would say intellectually. In general, my advice to existing in the academy is A, don't be an asshole, and B, make place for others. That's kind of my general advice. I think that should apply for many other areas as well. And within that, I also think that one of the things that I wish that I had known earlier in my life is that in order to exist in the academy as a Black person, as a queer person, et cetera, and so on, that one does not necessarily have to, even if one doesn't believe in it, perform certain ideas of bourgeois respectability, et cetera, and so on, right? That that is not necessary, right? I think that there are many quarters that enforce this, but I do think that is actually kind of the detriment, to the detriment of like whatever radicality you want to ascribe to Black studies, that ends up being like the main project, right? Oftentimes within within Black studies, and yeah, and it's not like I feel like people told me I had to do this directly. Those people that I was involved with, my advisors, et cetera, and so on. But I do feel like that the environment in general did give me those messages, and I wish I would have known a little bit earlier that I didn't necessarily have to do that. And yeah, so that's the advice that I would that I would give. I don't know if you want to ask some follow-up questions about that. Happy to do that as well. So.
Yeah, I guess I would just like to ask, like, what type of blowback do you think that you've received, or in general that you see trying to not succumb to the environment with these like bourgeois standards in doing your work?
I mean, it's in doing my work. Initially, it was just sort of carving out a space for what I was doing, because it didn't, like, something like sound studies didn't exist when I was writing my dissertation. So it was not necessarily, you know, my direct advisors, because they at some point were just like, we trust you. We don't really know all that much about what it is that you're writing about, but we trust you as a person, as, you know, someone, as a thinker. But I think in terms of the broader, the kind of the broader situation, that there was this kind of push of, like, you know, because I got my degree in a literature department, all this anxiety, which I still sometimes get, whereas like you're not really writing about literature, which is actually very untrue if you look at the actual work, but it's just sort of that kind of like super ego that gets positioned. And then I think it's less necessarily as time has moved on in terms of you know, the kind of ideas, written work, et cetera, and so on, but more in terms of existing within institutions, teaching and mentoring and advising, where there is oftentimes a kind of push to be, for lack of a better term, the police, right? And saying no to that is difficult because there is usually a pushback, and I'm not necessarily sure that people are invested in that in and of itself, but I feel like oftentimes, and this is what I was trying to relay, it becomes the default, right? Because that's how things have existed. And for me, what I'm really sort of trying to put into practice is like, what happens if we try to do things, if we try to do things differently, right? How can we sort of take the ideas of Black studies and not only put them of, you know, the kind of whatever you want to call it. Every term is loaded at this point in time, but I'll just say it like the kind of liberatory dimension of Black studies. How do we put that into practice in terms of the kind of everyday work that we do within institutions as teachers, you know, as administrators, et cetera, and so on. And I oftentimes feel like, you know, there's a real big disconnect between that, right? In the same way as, you know, there's all this writing and thinking about how there oftentimes is in activist spaces all these this kind of rhetoric of love, liberation, et cetera, and so on, while like violence is still meted out on this kind of interpersonal level, right? And I think that happens within academic institutions a lot. And yeah, so, you know, and I think, you know, it's not like I always bought into it, but I think it took me a while to kind of completely disinvest from it, right? And I do think there's also a way that might not be possible, you know, if one is starting out in one's career, et cetera, and so on. But yeah, I do think it's worth thinking about and, you know, trying to find ways around it from the beginning of one's career. So yeah.
Thank you, Professor. And that's a nice segue for our second question about what do you take to be the relationship between the disciplinarity and Black studies? In your book, Habeas Fiscus, you state that Black studies has developed a set of assemblages through which to perceive and understand the world in which subjugation is but one path to humanity, neither its exception nor its idealized sole feature, yet Black studies, if it is to remain critical and oppositional, cannot fall prey to the juridical humanity and its concomitant pitfalls, since this only affects change in the domain of the map, but not the territory. Would you say more about the role you think Black studies should have in bringing about systemic change? Additionally, where do you see Black studies developing in the next few years? And just kind of to tie this with some of your earlier comments, just also, how do you think this differs in like Germany versus a US context versus just like taking Black studies not just as something that's operates in the US, but also in other countries?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that, you know, when you say Black studies in other contexts, that Black studies rarely, if it exists at all, I think there's one Black studies program outside of the United States in the UK, and I think that it's 2 years old from what I remember. Maybe it's 3 years old, but it's fairly recent in terms of the history. And in a place like Germany, it very much it doesn't exist as a discipline at all, and it very much exists within sort of the margins of the university, and usually someplace between the margins of the university and, you know, foundations, other kinds of governmental and non-governmental nonprofits, and also the art world, right? That's sort of where Black studies happens. And I think that this is also, the point that I was making in Habeas Viscus is we can't reduce Black studies to its manifestation within the mainstream U.S. Universities, right? Since the late 1960s. That's one particular variant of it, but it has always taken place, and for most of its existence, it's always taken place outside of the United States, right? Outside of the university, and of course also outside of the United States as well, right? And I think that there's this kind of danger with the institutionalization of Black studies to make that the kind of end goal of what Black studies is, right? Is to have a seat as at the table, if you will, as opposed to trying to devise and put into practice a new table, a new room, right, new institution, et cetera, and so on. And I think that it's both an interesting and a frustrating moment within Black studies, because I think that in some ways that the level of discourse is really high, if you want to use that kind of hierarchical language, right? But I also think that oftentimes, like, the kind of original political impetus gets left behind, and it becomes solely about certain kinds of ideas, or about, like I said, this idea of having a seat at the table, right? And yeah, so I'll stop there. I mean, I have a few more things, but they're not quite as formulated as some of the other ideas. But maybe we can come back to it within the context of some of the other questions.
Cool. So this is a question I was really excited to hear you kind of talk about. So I just wanted to hear more about, hear you talk more about the musical genre and how that might relate to Winter's idea of genres of the human. And so how might the musical genre as it's currently formulated keep us within the current genre of the human as man, and maybe like trapping our ear to continue to think, to continue to perceive music in a certain way. So yeah, I'd just like to hear you talk more about that.
Yeah, I hadn't really ever put the two together, but I do think, yeah, there is definitely a connection, right? And I think there's a connection in terms of what kinds of genres, or what kind of genre gets prioritized within debates, the music industry, et cetera, and so on. And in terms of music journalism, there's been a lot of writing that the streaming age has sort of brought about this post-genre moment, right? Where everything is a particular genre, but also not a genre at all, right? Because it sort of combines like all these different these different parts. And I think, in terms of my writing and my thinking about R&B music, that has really been to the detriment of that genre, because on the one hand, it's kind of the genre that's given birth to all the other genres, literally any popular music genre, right, including country music, particularly contemporary country music, but of course also rock music, hip hop, you name it, house, techno, et cetera, and so on. At one point had a strong connection to root in R&B music, but on the other hand, it doesn't get recognized as its own genre, and therefore the kind of work that is, that's aesthetic, but also very much for me philosophical and political, gets completely erased and devalued, right? So I wouldn't want to let go of genre I'm thinking completely, but I also realize that in a lot of ways it is, it's kind of a trap and it's sort of a mirage, right? The moment that you start sort of poking some holes in there, it just completely evaporates. But I do think, given how the world works and given, that all this monetary gain, cultural cachet, et cetera, and so on, is derived from a genre such as R&B music without any acknowledgement of it. I would still insist on having it there as a genre without necessarily thinking that it has any kind of, ontological like weight, right? That it's kind of a historical genre that has its roots in segregation, right? That it has its roots in segregated music industry, the exploitation of Black artists, segregated radio landscape, et cetera, and so on. But it's nevertheless important in terms of keeping the work that it is doing in focus.
Yeah. So when we think about what you said there, I just want to throw in also maybe a comment from D'Angelo, because he said most of the that Soulquarian era actually refuted the term Neosoul. D'Angelo in particular was like, I don't make whatever that is. I just make Black music, and that's just So in that way, do you read that as an attempt to subvert genre or insert Blackness as a genre? Like, what do you kind of see happening there, maybe?
I mean, I think a few things are happening. It's now become common knowledge that the term Neosoul was invented by Kadar Massenberg who was then at Motown Records, and that it was very much a marketing category, right, to market folks such as D'Angelo, Erykah Badu, Maxwell, et cetera, and so on. And that for me, I have to say, it's a term that I have, at the very least, like strong issues with, if not a much more visceral reaction to. That it's a term and a category that initially excluded certain kinds of artists, right, that would musically be in that category. So for instance, initially, it never included Michelle Ndegeocello, right, who I would have put in that category and who was doing that kind of music way before the term in the early 1990s. And then I also feel like, and the way when I present my work on R&B, oftentimes I'll get a response saying, well, but are you going to talk about Neosoul too? And my response usually is, I really refuse that distinction, because it feels like, it's putting R&B music that is perhaps not as legible as, musical and original, et cetera, and so on, in this kind of throwaway category, right? So, what I guess to come back to some of the earlier points, I really feel like Neosoul, the way that I've encountered the term, is like a term of Black musical respectability, right? That, and this is, I love D'Angelo, I love Erykah Badu, I love Max, I love the music itself, but as a term, it feels like, to me, it's like, oh, this is going back to when artists actually played their instruments and they made real music that didn't sound fake, et cetera, and so on. So that, and it's putting it on this kind of weird pedestal that I feel like the artists themselves don't necessarily want to be put on. And it's also taking them away from, like, regular R&B, right? By making it into something more, I don't know, authentic, artful, et cetera, and so on. Whereas for me, there's not really, particularly in terms of status, there's not really, and music, there's not really all that much difference between Mary J. Blige and D'Angelo, right? Or SWV and D'Angelo. Yeah, so I think that, and it's the same thing with the term soul, right? Where, I remember one time I was doing a presentation, someone said, well, who are your favorite 5 R&B artists? And I included in that list Marvin Gaye, and the person was like, but Marvin Gaye is not R&B music. I'm like, but of course he is. That's soul music. And I feel like it's that same kind of distinction that came in with neo soul, and also a certain kind of, even though the artists themselves might not necessarily lend themselves to it always, but a certain kind of, I'm trying to find a polite way to say it, it's sort of like Hotep-ish, heteronormative modality of performing Black music and Black masculinity and femininity, even though I think that the figures themselves actually really resist that, right, in terms of their performances and their music, right? So yeah, but I could say a lot more, but I'll stop there.
Good. Thank you for that. I think that it might be, since we're on this train of music, it might be helpful to ask another music question just for the flow. So thinking about your process for approaching reading music for its philosophical import, how do you read music? How do you approach reading music in a way that doesn't flatten it to just being about academic discourse? Because of course it wasn't created for that purpose. And you kind of go into this in phonographies, but I would just like to hear more about that as well in your process of writing.
Well, thank you for that, for that question. And I sort of kept mulling over it, and one of the things that I've sort of that I was thinking about is, the go-to response would be something about pleasure, but then I realized I very rarely actually write about pleasure when I write about music, which I hadn't really consciously thought about. Which doesn't mean that I don't derive any pleasure from it. But what I think really, if I have to condense it down, what the music that I engage with kind of forces me to do is to show up in a much more full way than, I don't know, academic texts, for instance, right? Or literary texts. And this is not, I'm just talking about me, myself, and I. And I think that, with pop music, R&B music, other forms of music, there is a way that it elicits an immediate response, right? Do you stay in your chair? Do you go to the dance floor? Do you roll the windows down and turn the volume up, or do you turn the volume down? Do you skip over the song in the playlist, right? Or do you repeat it endlessly, as I'm likely to do with certain songs? But that initial response, right, and sort of everything that comes that comes after it is really what draws me to music, writing about music, and thinking not so much about music, but thinking with music, right? Yeah, and it also, because I usually tend to write about things, that I'm listening to at a particular moment, it also really forces me to think, or pushes me to kind of think about the now that I'm inhabiting critically, right? In relationship, with one particular song or several particular songs, how do they sound in relationship to all these other songs that are being released at the same time, around the same time? How do they relate to the past, right? To go back to D'Angelo, I mean, is D'Angelo just a copy of Marvin Gaye and Al Green, or is there something else that is happening? And I also think, that music is where Black thought has been, for both the good and the bad, it must be said, Black thought has been expressed most explicitly in the broadest array possible. Is that you don't really get that kind of breadth, right, of different sounds, thinking, et cetera, and so on in other arenas, whether this is in cinema, literature, visual art. And this is, again, not to downgrade any of them, right, but just to kind of think about the reality, right, of that. So yeah, so that's why I keep returning to it, because it does push me in ways that I feel like I'm not necessarily I'm not necessarily pushed by other things, both in the kind of pleasurable but also non-pleasurable way. But because there's also been moments where I have written about certain kinds of music. I'm just like, why am I enjoying this, right? When everything in it is for whatever reason, right? Political reason, aesthetic reason, et cetera, and so on, is not something that I would necessarily enjoy. And again, I also do like that part of dealing with that, right? I feel like it keeps me honest. To put it in a kind of basic way. And in terms of the looking, I mean, you know, crate digging is over at this point in time. I used to do that, not necessarily for writing about, but just, you know, in terms of listening to music, because that was what what was required, right? Going to particular clubs, going to particular record stores, listening to particular radio. I mean, this is, I'm talking about 1980s Berlin more explicitly, not listening to radio stations, but listening to particular radio shows that played soul music, that played house music, that played hip hop, etc., and so on. But it is usually, my engagement comes from having lived with these particular pieces of music for some time, and there being something there, either in the negative or in the positive, or some amalgamation of it, that keeps me sort of coming back and wanting to think about it, and think about it in relationship to these broader forces and ideas, right? So that, you know, to kind of, for instance, think about, why is it that the late 1990s, right, where R&B music had such a scale of mainstream success, where a term such as Neosoul becomes necessary, possible, and then necessary. Would that have even been possible in 1991 or in this year, right? If it hadn't been articulated then. So yeah.
Sorry, just one last comment, just to kind of back around. When you were talking about kind of what does music make us do, I think that's kind of what I'm trying to get at with the question of genre, and thinking the way that whenever I'm reading Winter and now Zakiya Jackson, I'm always thinking about the function of things. And so thinking about what happens when we maybe think about categorizing or measuring music based off of what it makes us do, rather than a particular sound or a where it's from, or, you know, things like that. Like what happens when we think about music and what it makes us actually do, and what it does to our bodies. So yeah, just thinking all of that together. But yeah, so.
Thanks, Zuri, for that additional comment. Now I'm thinking about that a little more, but just kind of to pivot a little, Professor, you offer a really interesting interpretation of Horton Spiller's Hieroglyphics of the Flesh. And so I was wondering if you can say more about how the flesh, according to Spiller's account, facilitates the category, how you interpret Spiller's account for facilitating categories of the human, not quite human, and non-human, and why you think it provides a stepping stone toward new genres of the human.
I think to begin with, I think Spiller's idea of the flesh is, for me, the closest any concept has ever come to describing such a broad array of things that I've been thinking about for many years, right? And I also want to say that in terms of my engagement with Winter and Spillers, that Spillers for me has, since I first started reading her in graduate school, has always been not only the model for the kind of ideas, but also how I wanted to write and how I wanted to think, right? And I think she does things very, very differently than I do, but I have, you know, there are all these moments in Spillers, for instance, where she sort of takes something that is not necessarily part of typical academic discourse, right? And she sort of inserts it into her argument, and it does all this kinds of work. For instance, when she's talking about her father's church in the race and psychoanalysis essay, there's so many different instances, even just the beginning of Mama's Baby, right? To begin with that list of names, right? It just makes you, again, I feel like the same way with music, that it makes you like respond to and show up in a different kind of way, right? That it just allows a kind of like polite academic objectivity and distancing. And that's really what I sort of take from her beyond the ideas, but just in terms of how to think and how to write, right? Whereas I would say with Winter, my engagement is much more, or has been much more in terms of the ideas, right? Winter is not a thinker in a way that I could ever emulate. That kind of like systematicness over hundreds of years and things like that. That's not how my mind works. Like it's not. And I appreciate that. You know, I think it's amazing. But I couldn't even pretend to write and think like that, right? Whereas I think, you know, what Spillers for me always modeled is a kind of more fractured, in some ways, musical way of thinking, right? That I've tried to not necessarily emulate, but like in terms of in terms of copying it, but just in terms of finding ways to do that in my own work, in my own language, et cetera, and so on, right? And I do think that the flesh, you know, it is such a broad concept, and it has such a kind of tumultuous history, right? In terms of thinking about religion, but also scientific racism and the history of science, et cetera, and so on. But what I think, you know, beyond habeas viscus and my current work, what I really take from it is it's a way of thinking about Blackness that allows for the thinking of the human and the non-human simultaneously, right? Because the flesh is not something that is particular to the human body, human flesh, and that's very much how I'm using it and thinking with it in the Schwarzsein project. And yeah, so I feel like it allows for a lot of work, and I think that one of the things that I wanted to emphasize in habeas viscus, because I felt like in the readings of Spillers that I'd encountered up to then, that the kind of debaseness and violence of the flesh was what was emphasized, and of course that is there. But Spillers is also in that essay and in her in her other work also perhaps doesn't go through it as explicitly as with the other part, but it does open up a possibility for being and living otherwise, right? And later on, she and this is in the forgetting the name now, the Arthur Jafa film, Dreams Are Colder Than Death, where she talks about the flesh as a kind of empathy, right? Yeah, and to kind of have those two things happening at the same time. And it also, for me, was a way to think about gender and sexuality in relationship, and it continues to be in relationship to Blackness. Some of that is in Spillers' work herself, some of it is not, right? But I think it sort of provided me and continues to provide me with a kind of language for thinking about Black, gendered, and sexuated embodiment or enfleshment in ways that I have not really encountered in a lot of other in a lot of other work.
Thank Thank you so much for that response. And I have some follow-up questions, but actually being mindful of time, I wanted to invite people to ask their questions. Just a reminder, in case anyone missed the beginning, if you're a workshop participant, use the raise hand feature and we'll call on you and then you can verbally ask your question. If you are for other audience members, you can just submit your questions using the Q&A feature and we'll read it, Zuri or I will read it for you. If there are no other questions, I will ask a follow-up, but just opening that. I guess also while I'll give people a moment to type and figure out what they want to ask, just because where you ended, I found that I've also been thinking about the flesh and gender. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how you're thinking about the flesh and the Black embodiment of gender.
I mean, for Spillers, it's very much tied to a kind of broken femaleness or femininity, right? Not exclusively, but predominantly. And the way that I read it, right, is particularly in relationship to Spiller's notion of ungendering, and to sort of think about how enfleshment, the flesh, goes hand in hand with the processes of ungendering, and again, the violence of ungendering, but also the possibilities that gives us for not only thinking about, but living Black gendered embodiment, flesh, enfleshment otherwise, right? In terms of not thinking about ungendering as lack, right, but as possibility and openness, without, you know, forgetting the violence that that initiates it, gives birth to it, right, as Spillers might say.
Samasa, you want to go on and ask your question?
Yes, hello, Dr. Weheliye. Thank you so much for everything you've given us today. I know that there are at least a couple sociologists in this workshop, including myself. And I know that you do a lot of work thinking alongside Du Bois and Sociology Hesitant, among many other writings. And I guess I'd want to hear you talk about what sort of work, what sort of speculative work is possible within the social sciences by working against the grain of the social sciences, and what Du Bois and potentially others have taught you or can be instructive in that vein.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think overall, I think that the pickings are slim at the very best in terms of the social sciences, particularly when it comes to Black life, right? Yeah, but I do think, you know, that Du Bois himself was always very aware of the limits of social science and social scientific methods when it came to Black life, right? Even in, you know, his most kind of respectable, normative, heteromasculinist, et cetera, and so on moments, that he still was very aware of that. And I think, you know, part of what makes Du Bois interesting still to this day is that because he was doing his work before these social scientific methods for tabulating Black life became codified, right, and calcified, that he was sort of trying to find different pathways out of that, right? And I think that also once, if you look at his career and you look at the later, his later writings beginning in the 1940s, but particularly beginning in the 1920s, I'm sorry, but particularly in the 1940s in texts such as Dusk of Dawn, where he very explicitly says that, you know, these scientific methods, et cetera, and so on, that he tried to pursue were not adequate for understanding Black life and for understanding anti-Blackness, racism, et cetera, and so on, right? And, you know, to also realize that alongside his social scientific work, that there was always, you know, more poetic work, whether this is, you know, something like The Souls of Black Folk or Darkwater, but also in his novels from the teens onward, that there was always this other part of Du Bois where he pursued more imaginative and prophetic methods for conjuring Black life, right? And I'm not saying that it's impossible to do the kind of critical work within the social sciences, but I think because of the history, right? Because this is the way that Blackness, Black life, anti-Blackness has been codified, particularly within academic discourse since the 1930s at this point in time, that it's much, much harder to kind of push away that baggage, right? That comes comes with it. But I do think, you know, that it is that it is possible as well. So, thank you.
Pyar, I hope I said that correctly. I'm sorry. You had a question?
You're fine, PR. Thank you all for this conversation. This has been fantastic. Dr. Weheliye, I had a question about analytics, particularly the analytics that we use in Black studies. On the one hand, at least for me, there's this feeling as if our analytics are becoming smaller and smaller, say the move from, say, the body to the flesh. But on another, as you mentioned, they seem to have the potential to be more capacious than ever before. But I think in either case, something that I've been wrestling with is whether these analytics are becoming smaller or larger. You know, to what extent is that a good or a bad thing? So I guess I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the analytics that we use and what that means for the kind of scholarship that we produce. So it's a big question, my apologies, but that's kind of where my head is at the moment.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, the first thing that I'll say is, for me, the flesh is not necessarily making things smaller. It's much more about opening it up, right? And the way that Spillers writes about the flesh, for instance, in terms of the mass on the middle passage, right? The mass of Black flesh that gets quantified, et cetera, and so on. So it's not really a move towards the micro, but more about the kind of in-between spaces between what we might think of as the human and the environment and other parts of the world that we that we inhabit, right? And yeah, I'm thinking. I mean, I think that. I mean, I think that there in terms of the kind of smallness, the one way that I would sort of come at thinking about this is with regard to the whole question of the archive and critical fabulation, et cetera, and so on, not only in Hartman's work, but in Sarah Haley's work, Marisa Fuentes, et cetera, and so on, that does seem to be focused on these kind of smaller things. But I also think that a lot of the debates are much more about trying to find sort of global and very, very broad ways of thinking about Blackness, but particularly also anti-Blackness, right? So I think that both of those things are currently very much in play within debates within within Black studies, and I'm not really sure that there's necessarily a way to solve that, even if it needs solving that particular tension, right? I do think that it's good that there are different kinds of approaches that we have access to, that we can engage in or not engage in, et cetera, and so on, right? And I do, but to kind of answer your question, I do think there's value in both, in terms of thinking more about the kind of very broad global, but also thinking about the the micro at the same at the same time. And for me, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Kristen?
Thanks, y'all. Thank you, Professor Weheliye, for your comments. I have a question or comment. I'm not quite sure what it is because it's not fully formed, but I appreciate how this conversation, and like in particular the aspect of your work that is about Black music, like invites me at least to take what has, I think my relationship to Black music is like about my visceral enjoyment of it. And it's like inviting a noticing or just an examination of my relationship with it. But yeah, I just want to kind of elaborate a curiosity I have. So I'm from North Carolina, but I'm currently based in Brooklyn. And it took me coming to Brooklyn and like finding circuits of music, DJs, kind of dance spaces that I enjoyed to notice that there's this tendency of kind of European, mostly like Swedish, but also like some folks from Germany to collate Black music in a way that I'd never seen it so like organized and kind of like just like collected and curated. And I guess part of my question is interested in the questions of your intellectual origins that were posed at the beginning, but like where and what the kind of market of Europe and European consumption of Black music is about, and also if there are other like factors or forces on that kind of interest. I don't know if I'm like describing it super well, but it's just curious to me the way that like there's a lot of again like folks and spaces in parts of Europe that seem to really have like this deep and abiding interest in R&B, soul music from like decades long productions in Black musical life. And so I just, if that makes sense as a kind of frame of questioning, I'd like to hear you speak to that.
Yeah, and I mean, we can throw the Brits, the white Brits, into that mix too. I mean, I think they're the ones who really perfected that, right? I mean, we wouldn't have the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, et cetera, and so on, if there wasn't Eric Clapton, if there wasn't that kind of curatorial spirit, right, of particularly engaging with decades-old Black music, right, whether this is the blues or R&B music, right, and yeah, I mean, I do think that there is a way that that initially it's like, oh, there's a kind of because I think one of the things that happens within Black music is that things just change, and it's usually about the new, right? There might be a moment where you look back, et cetera, and so on, but in general, it's about moving, perhaps not forward, but to a different place, right? And I think what then happens is, and this happens in the United States too. I'm forgetting what is that record label that curates the old Black music? I think it's actually based in Chicago, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, Numero. Thank you, Tyrell. It's the same kind of logic, right? That on the one hand, in some cases, it's nice to have these releases and for things to be made more broadly available. but it also is this way in which then these folks take ownership over that over that music, right? And I think it is really important that in most cases it's about Black music that's basically dead, for lack of a better term, right? That it's not sort of being engaged by Black people in the contemporary and so on. But it does. There are also other cases, and going back to 1980s Berlin again, and the beginning of the 1990s, where there was a very, very clear contemporary moment of taking techno from Detroit, right? Black music, Black producers, et cetera, and so on. I'm just thinking about this because one of the most prominent Black female techno producers, Kelly Hand, passed away yesterday or the day before. And that there is then a concerted effort at some point to make this something explicitly German and therefore white, right? And I think this happened with rock and roll before, but it works so well with techno because it's an instrumental music and there was not a lot of visual language around it, right? So that it works so well that it can be sold back to audiences in the United States as white music, right? So when I teach classes, students are sometimes surprised that techno is indeed Black music coming from Detroit, and it's not just some white European influence and so on. So yeah, I think that there is a way in which that kind of, I don't want to call it appropriation because it seems very mild, but taking ownership over Black music in that particular way is really is really pernicious and is not something that really is going away, right? And of course, it's also a question of money, right? Who has the money and who has the resources, right? Either themselves or from some kind of record company apparatus to be able to release, I don't know, like blues music from Florida in 1964, right? To go down there to talk to the people, et cetera, and so on. So yeah, so I think and also the repackaging, the way that it is usually repackaged, is kind of, if the music is not dead already, it becomes dead in that particular moment. Oftentimes, I find. So yeah, I mean, I do think that definitely plays that definitely plays into it, and yeah, and we could even, not necessarily in terms of the curatorial thing, but I think that this is also something that has happened to hip hop over the years, right? That if you look at the kind of recording industry, the journalism that goes along with it, that it is predominantly white men, right? Not only, but predominantly. And what has that done to the genre of hip hop and the kinds of hip hop that are that are privileged within the broader public sphere, right? So it's a danger that is that is almost always there in different kinds of ways.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate especially your like expression that the kind of deadening of Black music is where there's like a great deal of investment, and makes me wonder if there's like libidinal aspects to.
Oh yes.
You know?
Yes, there's definitely libidinal aspects to it, right? And I think that the deadness, it makes it seem more safe in some ways, right? But there's definitely in all of these in all of these things there is a deep sort of yeah, libidinal and violently libidinal. Let me put it that way, violently. Not that it's never not violent in those cases, but it is a violently sort of like libidinal ingestion of that of the music and the cultures and the performers associated with it.
All right. Well, that was a great conversation. Yeah. So we do have one last question. Unfortunately, we can't get to it. We are at time. We're past time right now, actually. But this was a great conversation. Thank you, Dr. Weheliye. for talking to us, engaging us in conversation. Thank you everyone who asked questions. So we will resume tomorrow at 12 with our first panel. And so, yeah, thank you again, everyone, for coming. So.
Thank you. Take care.